I'm Vinnie Politan. The subject of my investigation is the Menendez brothers. Say their names to anyone around my age and they'll have a very strong opinion. And now, because of all the current TV series and renewed interest about this case, you can ask anyone even a little younger than me, and they'll have an opinion about this case. So here's the story of Lyle and Erik, the Menendez brothers. It is one of Court TV's most legendary trials. The Menendez brothers, Lyle and Erik. In 1989, their parents, Jose and Kitty Menendez, were murdered. It was a shocking crime scene that looked like a mob hit. Jose and Kitty were shot several times as they sat on their couch, eating ice cream and watching a movie. At first, Erik and Lyle were treated as victims, but when their therapist's ex-girlfriend came forward with information that the brothers had confessed during therapy sessions, everything changed. Eventually, the brothers were charged. At trial, they claimed to be the victims of sex abuse and violence. The first juries could not reach a unanimous verdict, and there was a mistrial. But when they were retried, they were convicted and sentenced to life without parole. But now there is new attention on the case, and some are calling for the Menendez brothers to get out. This was really one of the first huge trials at Court TV. This preceded the O.J. Simpson case. And for the nation, I remember how everyone was watching these two young, rich kids, and everyone had an opinion, trying to figure out, are they telling the truth? Are they making this up? What is this really all about? So what I want to do for you right now is show you some of their testimony from the Menendez brothers. The testimony that captivated the nation.
Between the ages of 6 and 8, did your father have sexual contact with you?
Yes.
And how did it start?
It just started with, after sports practices, he would massage me, and we would have these talks, and he would show me, and he would fondle me, and he would ask me to do the same with him, and I would touch him, and we would undress.
My dad came in and told me to take off my clothes and to kneel on the bed, and he closed the blinds and he put the slide underneath the door like he always did, and he told me to bend over the footboard.
It was graphic. Now, their testimony at the trial is evidence, and evidence that has to be evaluated, right? Do you believe them? Do you not believe them? Right? Are they telling the truth? But all of this brings me to my first question, which involves not their testimony, but in addition to their testimony, was there evidence that the boys were being molested? Something outside of their testimony, which is evidence if it's believed. But how about additional or corroborating evidence? Joining me to help answer this question, investigative journalist and author of the book, Down the Hill, Susan Hendricks is with us. Also joining us, one of the jurors from the Menendez brothers trial and the author of the book, Hung Jury, The Diary of a Menendez Juror, Hazel Thornton is with us. Thank you both for being here. I wanted to put this up on the screen because I think this is one important piece of evidence I think people could consider. And this is a letter from Erik Menendez to his cousin, Andy Cano, in December 1988. It's still happening, Andy, but it's worse for me now. I can't explain it. He's so overweight that I can't stand to see them. I never know when it's going to happen, and it's driving me crazy. Every night, I stay up thinking he might come in. I need to put it out of my mind. I know what you said before, but I'm afraid. You just don't know Dad like I do. He's crazy. He's warned me 100 times about telling anyone, especially Lyle. Am I a serious wimpus? I don't know. I'll make it through this. I can handle it, Andy. I need to stop thinking about it. Susan Hendricks, powerful
Yeah, and
words.
I think he was very close to his cousin, Andy, and he confided in him the first time at age 12, saying, "This is happening to me, but don't tell anyone. I can't trust anyone but you." So Andy kept this inside and then was on the stand and testified to that letter. And that letter was found by his mother, by Jose's sister, who found that letter after her son passed at the age of 30, sadly, from an overdose. And so I believe it is new evidence. This is from Erik writing a letter that he didn't think anyone would read to Andy Cano, his cousin, saying it's happening again. And what you just read, Vinnie, the horrific detail of that, not to mention the other family members that testified during the first trial. As I mentioned, Jose's sister, Kitty's sister, also testified on behalf of the brothers. So I believe that all of that testimony is proof that it did happen, that they confided throughout their life. As young as 7 years old, Lyle was confiding in a cousin who spent summers with them in Princeton, New Jersey.
Hazel, you were there in the middle of it all. As you look back now, it's like decades now. Was there the corroborative, the compelling evidence that this abuse was actually taking place, or had actually taken place, and it wasn't just two kids coming in and trying to scrape together some defense to some horrific charges?
They had over 50 people testifying, not only to, there were not cameras in the bedroom proving sexual abuse, but there were lots of other kinds of abuse that other people did testify to, such as neglect and physical abuse, mental abuse, and emotional abuse, and including expert witnesses. And the prosecution did not present anyone to refute that evidence. I've been told by experts in the field that they had more evidence than most cases do that to prove sexual abuse.
You know, Susan, as we sit here now, decades later, in a Me Too world that has, I think, changed the perception and the way people look at allegations like this, I want to put this up because this is something else that has happened. A petition for writ of habeas corpus. Here's what they're saying. In the fall of 1983, Menudo, which is a pop group made of young children, signed a multi-year deal with RCA Records. At the time, the father, Jose Menendez, was an executive at RCA. In 1983, 13-year-old Roy Rosello joined the group. During the trip to New York, Edgardo Diaz asked Roy to do a favor, instructing him to go downstairs at the hotel and join Jose Menendez in a limousine. Roy did so and was taken to a home in New Jersey, given wine by Jose Menendez, and I'm going to say it, I'm reading it's part of the allegations, and anally raped. Roy lost consciousness, woke up back in his hotel. He was bleeding. He was in unbearable pain for a week. Susan, what does this do to the perception and the credibility of these allegations? You have someone who's not even a family member.
Yeah, and I would recommend the documentary on Peacock, Menendez and Menudo, Boys Betrayed. It's Robert Rand is part of this, the journalist who's followed it from the start, and I'm lucky enough to have spoken to Robert Rand as well as Hazel to discuss kind of everything we thought. And you mentioned perception, which is key, Vinnie. I remember being in high school and seeing that People magazine cover and thinking, because my sister went to Princeton Day School for a year with Lyle, so we kind of knew of them, and to see that, and it said, murder in Beverly Hills, cops say they did it for money. And I'm not the person I am now. I'm not deep diving into cases, and I thought, wow, for money. Now I think to myself, that doesn't make sense. They had access to all of the money beforehand. Why would someone do that for this? And I was lucky enough, as I mentioned, to get to know Hazel. And she even said to me, before she was selected as a juror, she saw the People magazine cover too. So I think it's all about perception. And what I think that Menudo member coming forward to say this all those years later, think about how much we know now compared to the late 80s, early 90s, having the fortitude and being brave enough to come forward and saying this, I believe it shows a pattern. And he is saying that man did it to me, and I believe him.
Let me ask you, Hazel, as you watched them testify about this, what were you thinking? What were you taking in, and what did you believe?
Well, every minute of the time, I was thinking, do I believe them, or are they just good actors? In the end, and for 20 years, I waited for the other shoe to drop. What am I going to learn about them that's going to prove that they lied or that there's something else to this case? But now it's been 30 years. And I think that they were so believable because it was true. And I think that people these days are ready to believe them. And a lot of people do believe them these days.
Okay.
Because Court TV released all of the first trial tapes. That was an important day in my life, for other people to be able to see what I saw.
Absolutely. Now, second trial, obviously a different situation. No cameras for the second one. Not as much evidence was permitted, and that's where the conviction was. But Susan and Hazel staying with us. Coming up next, and this I think is an important question with this. Do men and women see this differently?
The court finds, based upon the statement of the foreman and all of the jurors, that there is no reasonable probability that a verdict can be reached in this matter as to any count and as to any verdict. And therefore, the court finds that the jury is hopelessly deadlocked and declares a mistrial in this matter.
Sarah Boone is charged with second-degree murder after her boyfriend suffocated inside of a suitcase.
He's in the suitcase still. There are multiple domestic violence incidents.
You two hitting each other.
Sarah.
It's my name. Don't wear it up.
He told you, Sarah, I can't breathe.
George Torres locked inside of a suitcase, begging for help.
I thought he was okay.
The Suitcase Murder Trial. Live coverage next Monday, 8/7 Central on Court TV.
You indicated earlier that, in an earlier note, that things have pretty much remained constant for about 3 weeks. Is that correct? And these numbers that are reflected here, is that pretty much how it's been for the last 3 weeks? Okay. All right, then the court finds, based upon the statement of the foreman and all of the jurors, that there is no reasonable probability that a verdict can be reached in this matter as to any count and as to any verdict. And therefore, the court finds that the jury is hopelessly deadlocked and declares a mistrial in this matter. And the jurors will be discharged from further service in this case. The court, in reviewing this numerical breakdown, finds, in addition to the remarks of the jury and the jury foreman, that there is no reasonable probability of the jury reaching a unanimous verdict in this case as to any count or any charge. Therefore, I find that the jury is hopelessly deadlocked, and the court declares a mistrial in this matter.
So in the first trial, each defendant had their own jury. So there were two juries deliberating, and neither one of them could get to consensus. Both were hung. There was a mistrial for both Erik and Lyle. Take a look, 1993 trial. Erik's jury, 6 men, 6 women. Lyle's jury, 7 women, 5 men, so pretty evenly distributed amongst the two genders. Then you take a look in 1995, and you had 8 men and 4 women. That was a conviction. Now, the evidence was limited regarding the allegations of sexual assault in that second trial, which is another big factor in this. But I remember the discussions at the time, and we talked a lot about it in the podcast that I did about this case, about men and women. So that brings me to my next question. In the case of the Menendez brothers and the allegations, do men and women see this differently? And I'll be honest, you go back to the 90s, I go back to the 90s at least, right? There was a different perception. Men not as open, from my perspective, in being open to these allegations. They're grown men. They're grown men. They could have just told someone. They could have walked away from it all. Women saw it differently in the court of public opinion. But how about inside the jury room? Still with me, investigative journalist Susan Hendricks and Menendez trial juror Hazel Thornton is with us, who was you're on Erik's jury. So let me ask you, was there anything like that going on in the jury room? Was it different for men and women in the way that they perceived the evidence in this case?
That's all that was going on in the jury room. It was a battle of the sexes. And the men had a really hard time accepting the notion that a grown man could be molesting his boys. And it was a problem that they were teenagers at the time. And I think it was a problem for everybody in the 90s. The reason it was easy for me to accept, it wasn't easy for me to accept, but we had expert witnesses explaining to us, including Ann Burgess, who told us about how, she thought the killings were done out of, in the heat of passion, out of fear. And we got expert witness testimony about how a child's brain develops when he's being abused. And so we had basically a seminar on child abuse during the trial that allowed the women to understand what was probably going on in that house. But the men didn't buy it.
The men didn't buy. I remember having those conversations, not in the jury room, not in the courthouse, but at the law firm I worked at. Susan Hendricks, your thoughts about the way men and women were seeing this case and saw the evidence and the testimony and the allegations.
Really about perception and watching court TV, rerun those clips and watching it again and thinking about when they walked in, what people said were Armani suits and how they looked. That mattered. Perception mattered. So you're right. In the 90s, it was hard for anyone to grasp. You're older. Why can't you just walk out? Then you hear all the evidence. And in that evidence were naked photos of the boys from the neck down. Erik was 6, Lyle was 8. On the envelope, it was Kitty's handwriting. It said Erik's 6th birthday. So then you go to the next trial. As you mentioned, both jurors deadlocked, mistrial. Go to the next trial, the breakdown's different with men and women. I believe, in my opinion, Gil Garcetti had something to do with this. I know they just had lost OJ. And to not allow that evidence in, the evidence of abuse, I believe it was decided even before they went to trial, maybe during jury selection, selecting so many men. But absolutely, Vinnie, think back to the 90s, 89, 88. You look at them, you perceive them as living in that house with wealth. You hear about the shopping spree, and you convict them. Now it's different.
Hazel, it's amazing. So it was literally 6 men voting guilty and 6 women voting, is it not guilty or guilty of something lesser?
Yeah, it wasn't guilty versus not guilty. It was manslaughter versus murder. And there's a big difference. If they had been convicted at the time of manslaughter, they would have served a maximum of 22 years each, which would have been, they would have been out 12 years ago, even if there had been no good behavior time off. And they, so I voted for manslaughter, and that was the issue, is that there were so many different levels of guilt for us to choose amongst. It was not a matter of the women wanting them to go free.
Right, and Susan, this is an important distinction, like understanding what you're guilty of, right? And it all has to do with the mens rea, what's going on in your mind. Why are you doing what you did? You know, why would two kids who were born with silver spoons go in and take out the people who've been taking care of them? And it was difficult for the men to understand that.
And Hazel mentioned this to me earlier and said, talking about the family members. Let's say someone did this to my sister. Would I testify on behalf of her kids if she did that? The family members still support Erik and Lyle. They still do. So Kitty's sister, Jose's sister, countless cousins, they still support this and say, look, there were hints. There were little things. We weren't allowed in the hallway when he brought the boys and shut the door. There was so much secrecy because, again, think about when it happened, and I'm talking when they were very young, when Erik confided and Lyle confided to their cousins. So think about that time. Your brain doesn't go there with a father because a father is supposed to love his sons, not hurt them like he did.
Hazel, we have about 20 seconds here. I want to get a final word from you on how different do you think it would be today?
I think it would be a completely different trial today. For one thing, their evidence would be allowed. And there would be evidence, well, there was evidence in the first trial of how a child's brain developed and isn't fully developed until the age of 25. But it was ignored in the first trial and probably not allowed in the second trial. And it would make a big difference today to have both of those things in play and not have them both excluded.
Big thank you, Hazel Thornton, one of the jurors who lived it, Susan Hendricks, who's been investigating this forever. Thank you both so much. I'm Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues. I'm Vinnie Politan. We continue our investigation of the Menendez brothers who committed the brutal double murder of their parents. But now suddenly, a lot of people are garnering a lot of sympathy and support around the world for these two brothers. Why is that? Here's the story. The Menendez brothers' trial was one of the most divisive in court TV history. The story of two young rich men, Erik and Lyle Menendez, growing up in the lavish suburbs of New Jersey and Beverly Hills. Their dad, a record executive. They seemed to have life on a silver platter, but behind closed doors, things were bad. The brothers took a shotgun and killed their mother and father. They then covered it up and lied about where they were. They spent tens of thousands of dollars in the months that followed until they were arrested and charged with murder. Then came the trial where they testified about years of physical and sexual abuse by their father. Everyone had an opinion. The public was split, and so were the juries. Then, at a second trial, they were convicted and sentenced to life. Now it's once again on the national agenda, the Menendez brothers, and everyone has an opinion about whether or not justice was served. So this case took on a life of its own. The first really big case here at Court TV, first huge case. And if you weren't around back then, if you're not quite as old as I am, it was a national conversation that everyone was having. And it was because of what we were talking about and what we were listening to. But in the beginning, it was a murder mystery because they weren't arrested initially. Not until there was information gathered by the prosecution related to therapy sessions. So let's take a listen to Erik Menendez, therapist, speaking on the stand and talking about what his client told him.
And we headed back to the office, and right before we entered the front door of the office building in which I had my office, he leaned back against, as I recall, a parking meter that was in front of the office door and said, "We did it." And I don't know if he said we killed our parents, but I asked him, you mean you killed your parents? He said yes. And from that point, we went back up into the office.
Huge, right? Could you imagine being the therapist at that moment in this big murder mystery? You are providing therapy, and then you get that information. So that brings me to my next question, which is, what, do we have it? What did they reveal to the therapist? What information did they actually reveal to the therapist? These things are recorded. The sessions are recorded. Take a listen.
I still think Mom was a suicide because, I feel that in her letters to Erik and I, she gave me the permission, and it's burdensome to continually be handed to me. Erik handed me it to talk to Mom. Dad handed a lot of things to me. She had given me permission to please carry out her suicide, and that it was obvious that she had decided in her mind she wants to die. She can't do it. And she doesn't want to talk about it. And there's nothing that I can do to help her. There's nothing anyone else can do. And she very much doesn't want anyone else to know that what Erik and I did took her courage beyond belief, beyond strength. There was no way I was going to make a decision to kill my mother without Erik's consent. I didn't even want to influence him in that issue. I just let him sleep on it in a couple days. Because I'm in a very good position to influence Erik on a lot of things. Because he knows that I care, and a whole number of issues that I can talk eloquently and whatever. But when it came to that issue, I wanted nothing to do with it. It had to be his own personal issue. He felt the same way I did about killing Mom. I feel angry toward my relative. Why didn't you do something when you knew what was going on and I didn't? And now when I found out, I did something about it. I did what I thought my mother would want me to do, which is please kill me. And I can't, and I just couldn't just kill my mom, and that would be ridiculous. I wanted to get rid of the source, but I couldn't live with that. Nobody could.
Let me bring in a guest joining us, clinical and forensic psychologist, researcher, expert on violent crime, and the author of The New Evil. Dr. Gary Brucato is with us. Dr. Brucato, in what they are revealing to their therapist here, what is the significance? What are you hearing? And what does it ultimately mean here?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Let's do this, Dr. Brucato, while we hook up.
There you are.
You have me on audio? Okay, let's bring back in Dr. Gary Brucato.
Yeah,
fantastic. So in these therapy sessions, what's the significance of what Erik and Lyle are revealing? What does it mean?
Well, because I'm sorry that there's an audio issue.
Audio issue? Let's do this. Dr. Gary Brucato, stand by. I'm going to play for you folks more of these recordings that were played in court. I mean, part of the evidence in the case. Take a listen.
She was very cold. My mother was always very good in stressful situations. Very calm. This was obviously something that was of extreme stress for her. If Erik would have walked in the room when she was crying, or when I did, frequently, she would stop crying. I want to talk about it. It's my own problem. Blah, blah, blah. She wouldn't let you in, though? No, very matter of fact also about stressful things, which would mean if I started saying, would be the issue. That was the thing that I had to get past first, the things he was doing to me, to get to the things he was doing to her, and there was just no way.
There they are, Erik and Lyle. What we're going to do, we're going to take a quick break right now. When we come back, we'll bring in Dr. Gary Brucato. We'll bring in our other expert as we go through the Menendez brothers. Another question tonight. Should Erik and Lyle be released?
What they are now looking at is what's called the recoding, the genetic recoding that develops into the, explains why the ability of the person to have this flashback, to have this thought come back into their mind with what appears to be no stimulation. In other words, they're not back in a traumatizing situation, but they're still getting the re-experiencing of the flashback.
One of the most successful true crime TV shows ever.
This is crazy.
Now has a new home on America's original true crime obsession, 48 Hours, on Court TV. Coming up next on Court TV.
Sarah Boone is charged with second-degree murder after her boyfriend suffocated inside of a suitcase.
Sarah, I can't breathe, babe.
I thought he was okay.
The Suitcase Murder Trial. Live coverage next Monday, 8/7 Central on Court TV.
Your research and other more recent research has to do with what? With tying this to what?
Well, applying this to the symptoms that we see in traumatized populations so that we can better assist and help someone who has had a traumatizing experience.
Testifying as an expert, big moment in the first trial of Erik and Lyle Menendez. And there was a murder charge, but there was also manslaughter, a reduced charge. And under that reduced charge of manslaughter, if that's what they were convicted of, Erik and Lyle would be out. But right now it's life without the possibility of parole. Which brings me to my next question, which is the question everyone is talking about, whether it's Kim Kardashian or Rosie O'Donnell, and that is, should Erik and Lyle be released? Joining me now, investigative journalist, author of the book, Down the Hill, Susan Hendricks, also with a serial killer expert witness in the Menendez brothers trial, Dr. Ann Burgess. All right, Dr. Burgess, first, let's get some more insight into what happened to Erik and Lyle based upon their testimony and other evidence. What does it do to someone, and why would it impact their behavior and drive them to the point where Erik and Lyle are killing their own parents?
Well, it goes back to what they experienced growing up, which we've heard a lot of in this trial and on your program. And what it does to the brain is the importance of what we call the re-experiencing, the more post-trauma, the ability of the brain to re-experience what has happened. And that's what we tried to get into, some of the description of that science that was coming out at that time in the 1990s. This was the decade of the brain, and there was a lot of research going into how our brains operate and what it's always thoughts drive behavior. So you have to get into the thinking that the person has. And so to answer your question, that the development of this in these two brothers as they're growing up, the abuse that was existing had a serious impact. And the imperfect defense, which I'm glad that you brought up, is where the manslaughter charge would come in. People seem to think, oh, did they do it or not? Well, that wasn't the issue. The issue was whether they had done it. There was no question about that. But the why of it was so critical in the decision. And that's where the imperfect defense, that they really believed they were in fear, and that prompted them to take action, they did.
So let me ask a quick follow-up on that. Because the concern of society is the danger of releasing killers back into society, right? So what drove them to take out their parents, is that something that is limited to their abusers, or in the formation of their mind, are they perceiving everything differently in life, not just their mother and their father, Jose and Kitty?
No, they were perceiving the parents. This was an issue. And the issue was, what would happen if the incest came out? That was a word that wasn't said much. One thing to say sexual abuse, but then to say that it was within the family puts it into a whole new category. And that was their fear of what the father would do once that came out.
Okay. Susan Hendricks, you know where we are now. I've had Rosie O'Donnell on the show. We know Kim Kardashian. Yep. We know others. The actors who are playing them in the series are coming out and talking about, saying it's too long, it's too many years. Where do you see the public sentiment right now as it pertains to Erik and Lyle Menendez, convicted double murderers?
I think people have strong opinions depending on what they know about the case. They initially hear gun down their parents, rot in prison. I don't believe that to be true. I think they should be out by now. I think that manslaughter should have been the charge based on what I've heard from testimony from that first trial. Even in 1977, I know that Erik went to the ER. He had an injury to the back of his throat. I mean, the details are horrific. They really are. I'm not going to say them out loud here, but if you look into this and you see the horrific details, picture, if you will, that it wasn't the parents, that they were strangers who did this to two young boys. Would you want them dead? Or you think, mom and dad, how can you do that? Mom and dad on the outside aren't necessarily what mom and dad are in that Beverly Hills home. They just aren't. That's my opinion. I think they should be out. And I think we have to thank the younger generation on TikTok for bringing this case to the forefront again and saying, wait a minute, I'm looking into this. We believe the abuse. We're not who you were as a society in the 90s. And even Lyle, who's been interviewed, said, you know what? The teens now that I see, the young people now, there are outlets on social media where you can say this happened to me, or they had no one to talk to, even though they did to their cousins. They confided in who they thought they could talk to. But of course, incest never would it be mentioned. And I believe they feared for their lives from Jose and Kitty, and I would too.
Dr. Ann Burgess, let me ask you the question. Should Erik and Lyle be released? And if so, what would you suspect their life would be like and the issues surrounding reintegration into society would be?
Well, that's the big question.
That's why we have you on.
So long.
We have you on for the big questions.
Yeah, this is so hard, the reintegration. I can't emphasize that enough. I do think they should be released. I felt that way back, how many years ago. So I think that they have done very important things in prison. I understand Lyle has done work with child abuse groups, and that I said says a lot. This was a domestic case, and when you ask, are they a danger to anyone else? I don't think they are. In domestic cases, they usually are not. This is not a serial case. This is not a stranger case where the killing is done in the service of more sadistic kinds of things. This was something that he did out of fear, and what would happen if the whole incest got out. So I think they will have a terribly difficult time, but I think that they are resourceful and they will rise to the occasion, and probably have had good support from their family all this time, so that a reintegration back into society would not be difficult.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Burgess. One thing that we see a lot is the cycle of abuse, right? Where children who are victims grow up, sometimes end up being abusers. What are the concerns there, and how can you deal with that ahead of time to try to prevent someone who's been abused from becoming an abuser?
Well, that's the important part of the intervention, the way that children are treated from a therapeutic standpoint, to make sure that does not happen. Because, as you say, it does. And we have to be really, really careful that that is addressed in any kind of therapeutic setting. So it's upfront. It's an issue that comes right to the forefront in any type, and they have to be supervised in some ways. That's why sometimes in cases no protection orders are given and things like that. I don't see it in this situation, given what I know about the case and certainly what has been brought up. It's so clear of the abuse that was missed, I think, by the men who could not understand male-to-male abuse. So I would hope that there would be some attention paid to this. I am glad that there was a spotlight on this. I think we should relook at many of the cases that have happened like this. This was very unusual for them not even to get parole or parole, because parole boards can always turn them down. But to never have an opportunity for parole, I think, takes away hope from people. And I think that's not a very human thing to do. So I'm against any of those, because parole boards, look at all of the serial killers. They come up every year, they have a chance, and they get turned down, but they keep trying. So I don't like to see hope taken away from people.
How many times did Charles Manson attempt to get out in front of the parole board? We saw it right here on Court TV. Sure. Susan Hendricks, your thoughts, how this could play out from this point forward, because it does seem to be a little bit of a drumbeat in the public arena. Support, which is unusual. Support for murderers is unusual.
Yeah, I think we demonized Erik and Lyle in the 90s, and just the People magazine cover and just who we were as a society. I was right there too, with the Armani suits, and then kind of hearing the abuse. It was called the abuse excuse, which wasn't allowed. And there were jokes, late night television.
Absolutely.
And as Dr. Burgess was speaking, I was thinking, what if it was the Menendez sisters? They were two women who were abused. Like, I believe that we are better as a society, and I believe that they should be let out. And I believe they will get the support. Just what Dr. Burgess said, they do need some sort of integration, of course, into society, but based on their behavior in prison, I believe that they should be let out into society. And I believe that we demonized them back then. I believe them now.
Big thank you, Susan Hendricks and Dr. Ann Burgess. Great to have you on. Folks, they are convicted murderers, and convicted murderers who don't get sent to death row on charges like this are supposed to serve life without parole, which means you die behind bars. Now, if there are legal issues, primarily new evidence or a change in the law that would create an injustice, then yes, this case deserves yet another look. But short of that, I'm not expecting Erik and Lyle to be released, ever. I'm Vinnie Politan. You know we'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues.